Thank you, Anny, for inviting me. It's always so nice to, and Jean-Marie, of course, for putting the idea in her head. It's always so nice to come at conferences where you don't only meet your peers, because you get to know different things and you get a different perspective on things. And I like to, as a non-peer to you climate researchers, to share some thoughts. Don't get surprised. I'm going to be fairly practical, but I hope that you like that. The Dutch Delta Committee 2.0. Why did I say 2.0? It's because Delta Committee 0.1, occurred in 1916. In 1916, we had extensive flooding reaching Amsterdam. And most of you have visited Amsterdam. You know Amsterdam now is non-tidal. Before 1916, it was tidal. So the first committee was formed, and they decided to realize the dream, actually, of Simon Stevin, the famous scientist that lived a couple of hundred years before that. That was to close off part of the Wadden Sea estuarine system and make a part non-tidal. That's how Amsterdam is non-tidal at the moment. Then we got 1953, which was referred to by several of you. 1953, we had a flooding in the south of the Netherlands. And then Delta Committee 1 was formed. It was again decided to shorten the coastline. So you close off these incisions in your shoreline to reduce the probability that you have flooding. So, I will introduce now Dutch Delta and also make a little comparison with the Mekong. I feel very privileged that the Dutch Delta Committee 2.0, which was established without a flooding in 2007, and that same committee is now advisor to the Vietnamese government, trying to compare our deltas and to see what concepts are transferable. Obviously, you understand that no delta is the very same. So it boils down to the question, which concepts are transferable? I'll try and address that. So, here you see, here you see the Dutch delta and the Mekong delta. So, here's the Dutch delta. France is somewhere over here. You see the River Rhine, the Meuse. We have a number of other rivers. This is the Netherlands delta. And it's comparable in size to the Mekong delta. So here's the Cambodia border. This Mekong River and these several branches, they produce an awful lot more discharge than the Rhine does. We're already unhappy when it gets over 16,000. The Mekong, on average in the wet season, has 42,000 cubic meters per second, which is quite amazing. You see also the extensive network that in the French time was made, trying to bring fresh water to the agricultural grounds, trying to prevent salinity intrusion, etc. Also, what surprised me very much is when I learned there's 17 million people also living in the Mekong. When we as Dutch children were going to primary school, we were taught the Netherlands is one of the most populated countries in the world. It's nonsense. The Mekong has as many. And if you come there, it's hard to believe that there are 17 million people there. Obviously, the Mekong also faces very strong challenges. Some things are comparable. We share similar vulnerability issues. Let me first mention to you that originally when we started in 2007 with the Delta Committee 2, our first assignment was to look at the vulnerability to due to sea level rise on our coastal regions. But when we, as a committee, came together under the chair of a former minister, Veerman, the committee came quickly to the conclusion that you cannot only look at that problem as such, because everything is connected. The whole water system is connected. So Veerman made a phone call to the minister, and he came back after half an hour and said, we have permission to look at the whole system. So what we try to do is look at all these issues that play a role together, like salinity intrusion over here, like subsidence, like high river discharges coming from the Rhine and probably the Meuse, freshwater issues, but also, besides flooding, drought. And it will not surprise you, the Mekong Delta has very similar problems. We have in the lower delta, we have, as we just heard, we have subsidence, we have groundwater extraction, we have saline intrusion, we have variability in the saline intrusion over flood and drought periods, and we have flooding over here. Now, one lesson that we're trying to discuss with the Vietnamese is that in our country, we've been busy with these problems for 1,000 years, right? And due to the technology available over those 1,000 years, the Dutch Delta has created a very sharp transition between, for instance, freshwater and saltwater, sometimes even by barriers. Why? That's obvious. If you want to economically develop, economy does not like to be surprised. Farmers don't want to be surprised. They want to know where the water is fresh and where it is salt. That'll allow them to develop in a rising economy. However, we know now that sharp transitions, for instance, between fresh and salt water, are detrimental for ecosystems. Ecosystems like transitions. They like transitions to vary over the seasons, because that gives resilience to ecosystems. It's like dams as well. Dams put a boundary between two ecosystems. So here are challenges. That is, can we find a balance between our wish to control the environment to fulfill our economic development wishes versus the variability that the ecosystem needs? And I'm very happy for the Mekong Delta that maybe they can learn from our mistakes. So there's a comparable geography, comparable population, we have comparable vulnerability issues, but there are also very marked differences. You saw before by Roderick van der Val that these parts where the largest economy is sitting have a very low probability of being flooded. They're meant not to flood with a probability of 1 in 10,000 per year. Now that's fairly different from the Mekong Delta. Over here in the north, it floods every year. And people have adjusted. They know what it is to live with the floods. In my country, about, Roderick, what was it, 6 years ago, we also had ads on television that we were living with high water. We're not living with high water. We're protected against high water. 1 in a 10,000 year probability, that's not living with the floods. The Vietnamese, they live with the floods. And there's the challenge. How can we resolve that in a way that also you preserve culture? Because it's also a way of living. So there's a lot of comparable issues in the generic sense, but when you become specific, there's a lot of differences. So in 2008, after a year study, we came up with a report with a number of recommendations, and these recommendations are now being prepared, and one of the things is to build a fund which would ensure the long-term funding of interventions that are necessary. And of course, what's interesting in an international context, talking to you people, but also in advising other countries, what can they learn from us, from our mistakes, and maybe from some of the things that are transferable. So I'd like to talk to you about some transferable concepts and recommendations. And again, I want to stress, there is no situation the same. So if you want to work in a region, you will have to understand the region. And it works the same nowhere. Yet, we can learn from each other. That's why I like being here. I learn from the things that you present. So I'd like to talk about risk approach, about scenario thinking, about some of the general recommendations we did and some of the regional recommendations. First, the risk approach. In the first Delta Committee, established after *53, we had a number of very clever people in the committee, and they also hired the mathematician von Danzig, and he proposed, in order to establish the level of protection that would be most economically optimal, would be to use the principle of economic optimization. So how does it work? It's very simple. It says that if your investment in safety increases, the potential damage that you will have will decrease. So the higher your investment, the lower your potential damage. And the total societal costs is the sum of those two, which has a minimum over here at A. So in terms of, let's say, sustainability, in terms of what we need to do to future generation is to minimize total societal cost. And unfortunately, if you look at New Orleans, before Katrina, their investment was approximately here. So the cost of Katrina for society have been twice as large as would have been necessary. Now, of course, the Corps of Engineers was aware of this, but it took Katrina to convince the United States that the level needed to be upgraded. And they've worked hard, and I'm very glad to be able to say that at this moment, this was a level of approximately 1 in 50, 1 in 100 probability, per year probability. Now they're at between 1 in 2,000 and 1 in 3,000. They've shortened their coastline. Maybe you remember the canals where they had the collapse of the dike systems. So they took that principle. Scenario thinking. Why is that important? It's important that you don't only look at average, mean predictions, because if you're responsible as a country to look at the longer term, you must also look at what are higher end scenarios and also lower end scenarios. You know that it's somewhere in between. So every intervention you take must be looked upon in the light of a scenario. And one of the things that we were very eager to know is whether or not we, as the Netherlands, would have to knock on the door of Germany. Would we be able to live in it, even if we get a high-end scenario in our delta? Can we afford it in terms of money? Can we do it technically? That's a very relevant question. Suppose we couldn't. It might take 100 years, but then you better start preparing now, and making good friends with the Germans, of course, in order to be able to withdraw ourselves there. So what did we do? We asked amongst others, colleagues of Roderick van der Waal. Maybe, were you involved, Roderick?
Yes.
Oh, he was involved as well. So we asked, well, the usual suspects, could I say that? All the people that in IPCC have their climate models. And we asked them to give us a plausible high-end scenario. So we said, run your climate models, make assumptions which are still plausible, but will give us an upper limit. And I don't know how the discussions went. Roderick will know better. We as engineers had hoped they would attach a probability to it. I was told they couldn't do that at that moment, so I was extremely happy to see Roderick telling yesterday about the first attempts now to address that seriously, because if you can attach a probability to it, we can make much better designs. You also need low-end scenarios, because if you make an intervention, you have to look at both the high end and the low end. You want it to be as adaptive as possible. So here is the high-end scenarios that were given, and they're specific to our region. And you see that the models, well, also even in 2100, have a fair range, 65 to 130. Again, these are high-end scenarios, so it's the still plausible, but most unfavorite assumption that you could do, right? And of course, the bandwidth gets larger, 2 to 4 meters in 2200. There was a little bit of confusion because these are average scenarios, and so they're best estimates and not high-end scenarios. Our chairman was so stupid to live on the television, for God's sake, to say it was the prediction. So some people were not amused. Amongst them Hans von Storch, I heard later. So if I see him, I still have to excuse my chairman for that. But you know how it goes with politicians. Sometimes they just lead you astray, and they mightn't mean it, but they don't always think well. Oh, sorry. No, it's going well. Another one is of course river discharges. The very same message. You also have to know the extremes, and the extremes go both from high discharge to very low discharge. Now, high discharge, I don't need to explain probably to you what is the significance, because we have the flooding. But don't forget that also the very dry periods are very relevant. I don't know which ones of you here drive a German car, but they'll get more expensive when this goes down, right? Because all the steel that goes to the Ruhr area over here, that builds these Beamers and Mercs, that's partly determined by the price of the steel, right? So before it gets very low, you might as well order one. And for us, it's quite relevant as well that if the Germans change their flooding strategy, that 18,000 may not be so high even. You've all seen the floodings in Germany last week. They're very good to us. They have very large retention areas, but they may not keep those, right? So we may have to count on even higher discharges. Let me get to, how much time will it take? 10 minutes? All right, just cut me off, right? Let me go to some general recommendations. Multifunctional building with nature. I always say to my students, building with nature Some people say it's a new paradigm. Of course, that's nonsense. People have built with nature for a long, long time. It is just that, now that we understand nature better and better, we can build better with nature. Don't tell that to your sponsors. They'll be very sensitive to new paradigms. Just say building with nature is the new paradigm. One of the very nice examples of building with nature is the extension of Rotterdam Harbor into the sea. As you know, many harbors worldwide, they all move to the sea. They need larger drafts, but they also need the very valuable grounds in the city, where you have nice apartments now along most harbor areas, because it's a very attractive place to live. So harbors move towards the sea. And here is the extension of Rotterdam, the second extension here in yellow, seen over here about a year ago. And what will be the case is that most of that, of the contour of that extension will be either a dune or a shingle beach. So it's a natural system which has a high resilience to impacts of sea level rise. And this is one of my dreams, to have a harbor at the area where Professor Saito has done his measurements, to have a harbor that's protected mainly by a mangrove belt. That would be building with nature. That would be something in Asia that would steal the attention, but also it would make a robust solution. Let me go to two regional recommendations that I think are interesting in international context and that will allow me to keep my time. North Sea coast. This statement was already made by my friend over there. So, we use nourishments quite a lot. Since the 1970s, very, very steady with traditional nourishments, usually nourishing the beach or the dune. Since the 1990s, we discovered shore-face nourishments. That has a lot to do also with public perception and with costs. I don't know how it goes in France, but presumably the same. When we did beach nourishments a lot, after the first winter storm, the papers were full. Those Egypts are being sent to the beach and it disappears. Of course it doesn't disappear, it's still in the profile, but that's not the public perception. So we could convince the minister, why don't we start using more shore-face nourishments? And then the public perception is the opposite. They see sand coming. So since then we have very little trouble. Also, it's half the price. All right? We have now an experiment going on. Why? Our country is probably ahead to many other countries, but all other countries will come there when it comes to the amount necessary to compensate for sea level rise. So we have to bring so much sand to the beach that it becomes an ecological issue. And so we did an experiment. We dropped a lot of sediment at a particular location, enough for 20 years. So instead of having to come back every 3 to 5 years, it's a one-time 20-year nourishment that is supposed to compensate for the erosion due to sea level rise over the next 50 years. So the design was, we'll lose 1 million per year, so we need 20 million. And so it was done. It took two very important champions to realize this, political champions. You cannot do without political champions, otherwise it will not happen. So we were very lucky. We had and were both women. We had a minister that was open to it, and we had the provincial governor that was open to it. And those two women decided they wanted to take up this challenge. And so I must compliment them for them still. And what did they do? They were able to, they had an amount of money, and we wanted 20 million. So we put it on the market, and we got 20.5 million cubic meters. And so that was realized basically over summer. It contains a lake, which has a lot to do with groundwater, fresh groundwater distribution. It has a lagoon in order to create an environment that is attractive. And here you see it, as it was finished, was a little bit more work done. So instead of nourishing every 3 to 5 years, it was a once in a 20-year mechanourishment. Of course, there's some little problems as well. This is nearly the very same moment at high water and low water. You know, the people that visit the beach there, they only know a little bit about tide, you know, but it's just basically a beach. If you walk here at low tide and you're caught, then you have a problem. And that happens. So we need a lot of public communication here as well. But by and large, it looks like it's being found very attractive. If you go to YouTube and search for sand engine or sand motor, you will find more than 5 films of kite surfers and wave surfers, and they say, we want more. They want 5 of those in the whole of the Netherlands. I don't think that'll happen, but you never know. Okay, let me nearly end now. One of the observations worldwide is that around rivers, urbanization has caused the narrowing of the riverbed, right? Because cities like to come close to the river. And so we do a program with 32 projects creating space, especially with an eye to the future. And here you see the additional space created in a more natural environment. And at this moment, they've just started at Nijmegen. So this is the original width, but they are now creating a combined urban and natural environment to widen the discharge area quite a bit. We're lucky we can afford it. So it shouldn't be a political issue. And that fills my 10 minutes, right? Thank you.